Benny Andersson battled something darker in the background while penning ABBA greatest singles. He remained silent for 20 years. Then, in 2011, when he was 64, he came clean. Alcohol was essential to his functioning during the heyday of ABBA. He was inebriated at every Grammy, Globe Tour, and smash single. However, it wasn't even the most difficult admission. He also explained the pain of songs like "The Winner Takes It All." They were about more than heartache. They served as a means for him to avoid having actual interactions. On December 16, 1946, Benny Andersson was born in Stockholm's Vasastan neighborhood. However, this was no ordinary birth. He was entering a household where music permeated every space like the air. Although Gasta, his father, worked as a civil engineer, his true passion was music, particularly accordion playing. Ephraim, Benny's grandfather, was even more significant because he used his accordion to play Swedish folk tunes at family gatherings. Music wasn't background noise at home. The primary event was that the music Benny heard as a child had been handed down through the centuries. Later, that strong ties to Swedish folk music would be incorporated into popular songs around the world. But nobody was aware of it yet. Not even Benny. When Benny turned 6, everything changed. He received his first accordion at that time. After a few days, it might have ended up in a corner for most children. Not for Benny, though. He had an obsession. Night after night, he joined his grandfather and father in singing folk songs. It was more than just enjoyable. Training was what it was. Training was what it was. He discovered how melodies communicate without using words and how music can tell a story. Waltzes, polskas, and schottisches all became ingrained in his musical repertoire. ABBA songs that packed arenas years later would reverberate with those similar rhythms. However, he was only a boy at that time. Acquiring the skills necessary to create music with those he cared about, Benny was prepared to move on from the accordion by the time he was 10 years old. It felt like home when he found the piano. He, the keys, and hours of trial and error were all that was present. No teachers, no lessons. He performed by ear, deciphering radio notes and modifying them to fit his own style. He disregarded the regulations. He created his own. He spent hours each day sitting at the piano. He gradually developed a sound that combined pop and folk, soul, and structure. Before long, he was able to switch between musical genres with ease. ABBA would use that mixture as one of his covert tools. The distinctive sound of songs like Dancing Queen is a result of Benny's solitary hours of problem solving. At the age of 15, Benny left school while most children were still attempting to pass arithmetic exams. The year was 1961. And he had already decided music was more than a fantasy. It was the exclusive route. He began playing in youth clubs all throughout Stockholm, particularly in the neighborhood of Vällingby. Even though he wasn't yet well known, people took notice. He was obviously more than just another teenager with a guitar, based on the way he performed and engaged an audience. He quickly became well known, and soon local producers and bands were mentioning him. It was dangerous. Dropouts were frowned upon in Sweden at the time, but Benny had no interest in safety. He was succeeding in his pursuit of something greater. Benny also went through something at this time that would have an as profound impact on him as music: fatherhood and young love. He got to know another musician, Christina Grönvall. They became fast friends and had a son by the time Benny was 17. Helen, their daughter, was born 2 years later. Benny was only a teenager at the time. The majority of children his age were only beginning to plan their future. And here he was, juggling rehearsals and diapers. If we hadn't met here, my life would have been entirely different, as Bjorn famously remarked. The two began writing music together shortly after their encounter. The song, Isn't It Easy to Say, was their first joint effort. For them, it meant everything, even though it wasn't a worldwide smash. The Hep Stars recorded it and included it on an album that peaked at number 12 in the Swedish charts. They possessed something unique, as evidenced by that song. They continued after that. They were honing their craft and creating the sound that would eventually rule the globe by the end of the 1960s, when they were writing for other musicians. But music wasn't the only thing on their minds. They were also considering business. They founded Union Songs, a publishing house that granted them complete control over their music rights alongside Stig Andersson, who would go on to become ABBA manager. At the time, musicians rarely made that move. It meant they didn't have to give it to other businesses when the big money started coming in. Their tunes were theirs. In the decades that followed, that choice would earn them millions and safeguard their heritage. Then came 1969. Benny had submitted the song Hedge Clown to the Mellowed Festival and Contest. After a heated voting, it finished in second place, but that night something more significant occurred. Benny met Annifred Ligstad, a teenage vocalist, backstage. They were dating in a matter of weeks. A musical affinity swiftly developed from their romance. She was more than simply his girlfriend. Her voice will eventually become one of ABBA. The group that would make all the difference was completed thanks to the meeting. Benny and Bjorn's album Lika, which translates to happiness, was released in 1970. They included their girlfriends Annifred and Agneta Feltskog to provide background vocals on the song Hedge Gamleman. That song was the first time the four future members of ABBA collaborated on a song. In Sweden, it became popular and peaked at number 5 on the charts, spending 5 consecutive weeks at the top of the radio polls. It was the beginning of something enormous, not simply a song. Stig Andersson gave Benny and Bjorn another chance a year later in 1971. They were employed by him at Polar Music as staff producers. They got everything they needed from that task: studio access, unrestricted experimentation, and practical recording and arrangement experience. They were evolving into more than merely songwriters at this point. Manufacturers utilized this opportunity to hone their abilities and experiment with new sounds. Later, ABBA's distinctive style would be shaped by these experiments. The night that transformed their lives then arrived. April 6, 1974. Brighton, England for Eurovision. Their energetic and extravagant outfits lighted up the stage as they sang Waterloo. The song had a 6-point victory, becoming the first Eurovision victory for Sweden. In addition to breaking into the US and Australian markets, Waterloo sold around 6 million copies. Here's the twist, though. Benny was not present at that live performance. Although he was on stage, he claimed years later that he didn't see the entire video until decades later. It had all been such a haze, he hadn't really processed it. After that evening, Benny and Bjorn were having a lot of fun. They wrote and produced all of the ABBA songs from 1972 until 1982, each and every one, from Fernando to Dancing Queen to Mamma Mia. Dancing Queen earned their sole U.S. chart topper and reached the top of the charts in more than a dozen nations. In 1976 alone, Fernando sold more than 6 million copies. These weren't only popular songs. All throughout the world, people could hear these anthems. Benny was famously meticulous. He would work on tunes for weeks until every note felt perfect. The song is still relevant today because of this. It was more than simply the melodies that contributed to ABBA's unique sound. Swedish folk music was a part of Benny's upbringing, and he never abandoned it. He combined it with disco, American rock, and British pop. The outcome was something fresh, emotional, yet catchy, happy, yet depressing. You danced to the ABBA songs. They made you feel, though. Benny's skill as an arranger and composer contributed to creating a sound that was both modern and classic. The band toured the world as their popularity skyrocketed. Benny, meanwhile, wasn't interested in the publicity. The studio always piqued his curiosity more than the theater. During performances, he kept the song tight by playing the keyboards, but writing was his passion. He continued writing while on the road. It was uncommon to strike a balance between making new music and performing live. Most choose one. Benny did both. ABBA sold over 385 million records throughout the years. Benny, however, never sought attention. He followed the sound. Even after the band ceased playing, he continued to create and push. And he was able to continue on his own terms because of those early decisions, such as beginning Union Tunes and learning production inside Polar Studios. With his band, Benny Andersson was already well known in Sweden. The stars of HEP. After winning a national singing competition, Annifred Ligstad, whom everyone nicknamed Frida, was becoming more well-known. Something clicked when their paths touched. It was imaginative as well as romantic. They formally announced their romance that same year. Benny began assisting with Frida's solo compositions. What started out as cooperation swiftly grew into something much more. They moved in together in 1971. They were no longer merely dating. They were constructing a sound as well as a life. Soon, that sound would be recognized globally as ABBA. Frida wasn't the only one. They were accompanied by Agneta Felskog and Björn Ulvaeus. One group, two couples, both on and off stage. The chemistry was genuine. Fans adored it. The couples gave it heart, even though the song was catchy. Frida and Benny were the band's emotional core. After living together for over 9 years, Benny and Frida were married on October 6, 1978. ABBA had already conquered Europe by that point. Radios all over the place were playing songs like Take a Chance on Me and Dancing Queen. Their wedding was more than a private celebration, even in America. Fun. In Sweden, it made national news. The ceremony was crowded with paparazzi. For a look, fans gathered outside. It appeared to be a fairy tale at first glance. However, things were more complicated behind the scenes. In the studio, Benny had always felt more at ease than in the actual world. Later on, he acknowledged it. Music was a better medium for him to express himself. Benny poured his emotions into chords and melodies, but Frida opened up more readily. The music, not the conversations, was the lifeblood of their love. That worked for a while. There was an unfake fire in their duets. However, the distance became apparent once the recording ceased. Frida desired a relationship. Benny frequently shuts down outside the studio. Over time, that emotional disconnect widened. The intimacy began to give way to loneliness. Frida yearned for honesty and unadulterated love. Instead, Benny contributed harmonies. Their relationship subtly deteriorated as their music continued to sound better. They split up at the end of 1980. A year later, the divorce was finalized. The timing couldn't have been more revealing in 1981. The days of ABBA were numbered. The Visitors, their last studio album, was released in the same year. It had a distinct, sadder, and deeper sound. Songs like One of Us and When All Is Said and Done conveyed genuine suffering. The audience sensed it. They were listening to two marriages go apart in addition to a band. Some claim that because of how authentic it was, that record is a pop classic. Its soul came from the split of Benny and Frida. However, Benny had been fighting booze for years in a silent battle. As everyone was dancing to ABBA hits in the height of their glory, Benny's drinking was getting worse. Ow! It made it easier for him to get away from the stress, the emotional strain, and the agony of his failing marriage. No one was aware of its severity. Hit after hit, he continued the show. However, he was collapsing inside. Later, he stated it explicitly. Alcohol was essential to his functioning. He realized he was in trouble at that point. Partying wasn't the point. It was a matter of survival. It was necessary for him to feel normal. He was frightened. He had everything because of his fame. Addiction, however, threatened to rob it all. 20 years after ABBA's final big UK hit, The Winner Takes It All, Benny gave up alcohol in 2001. There was more to the timing than chance. It was a complete circle. One chapter comes to a close and another begins. He received assistance. He survived and maintained his sobriety year after year. He eventually came clean about his addiction in 2011. Fans saw the man as well as the artist for the first time. However, it was not the end of the story. Later on, his son Ludwig also battled addiction. It was devastating. Benny had experienced that conflict firsthand. They discussed it. They helped one another. Ludwig acknowledged that addiction may spread quickly, particularly if it runs in the family. The stillness was broken by their candor. They demonstrated to the world that even the most resilient families can overcome this obstacle. Music is said to have healing properties. However, it was frequently a means of concealment for Benny Andersson and his ABBA companions. Arguments did not reveal the anguish of Björn Ulvaeus and Agneta Felskog's 1980 divorce. It was sung. The winner takes it all in one night, Björn wrote as he sat down and poured himself a drink that same year. It had nothing to do with their divorce, he added. Nobody took him seriously. Tell me, does she kiss like I used to kiss you? Was one of the lines Agneta had to sing. She gave it with such unadulterated passion, it made everyone in the studio cry. Björn referred to it as a sound-wrapped message. It was not a discussion. It served as a means of expressing what was impossible to say out. Benny Andersson was going through his own separation with Frida at the same time that Wound was still open. They were divorced by 1981 after being together since 1969 and getting married in 1978. When all was said and done, that pain gave way. Benny was able to convey the finality and numbness of a relationship that had reached its end. He had no intention of making amends. All he was doing was attempting to interpret the quiet. Frida sang the song while going through the heartbreak it talked about. We'll pay the tab when we have one more toast. Although it seemed like closure, it was actually avoidance. Later on, Benny came clean. The purpose of these songs was not to process feelings. Their goal was to avoid them. He claimed that he avoided the discomfort by using music as an escape. To keep the difficult talks private, he admitted that I didn't give my greatest lines to the people who needed to hear them, but rather to songs. The words he couldn't utter were spoken by his piano. The band members' quiet gradually grew longer. Although the music was lovely, the relationships were dissolving. They simply disappeared. ABBA didn't explode. Four people gradually drifting apart. No dramatic exits, no media dramas. Agnetha and Bjorn were gone. Frida and Benny were gone. The feeling of the studio sessions was heavy. Termed it a death of creativity. The happiness had vanished. They persevered until 1982, but the spark had died by then. The worldwide craze was subtly disintegrating. The world witnessed a flawless pop machine. In reality, there were four weary individuals lamenting something they were unable to change. Benny didn't stop after ABBA. He and Bjorn collaborated with Tim Rice on the musical chess in 1983. They dedicated 3 years on a tale that was based on a chess match between Bobby Fischer and Boris Spassky and Cold War tension. It was more than just a play. It was politics, passion, and strategy turned to song. Despite being outlawed in Thailand due to its lyrics, One Night in Bangkok became a worldwide smash. I know him quite well. For 4 weeks in a row, a duet featuring two women who are in love with the same man topped the UK charts. In 1986, Chess made its debut in London's West End and lasted for 3 years. Benny had found a new stage, but ABBA was gone. However, despite his success abroad, Benny kept feeling drawn back home. He went back to his roots in the 1990s. He and Bjorn spent 5 years working on Christina from Du Vemola, a musical that tells the story of a family's voyage to America and is based on Swedish literature. It debuted in Malmö on October 7, 1995, and ran for 671 performances around Sweden in the 1800s. More than 1 million individuals attended. For 74 weeks, the cast album was in the top charts. On Swedish radio, one song, Guldet Blev till Sand, broke all previous records. Benny was dubbed a modern-day shoebird by critics. He had stopped pursuing hits. He was searching for purpose, memory, and history. The world stage then returned. Christina made it to Carnegie Hall in New York in 2009. It performed at London's Royal Albert Hall a year later. Helen Schuholm, the original star, sang again with Russell Watson, a British tenor. With the support of a 50-piece orchestra, they shared the Swedish tale with people around the world. Even though the event was cut to just under 4 hours, every second mattered. Its success had been questioned by American producers. It was too lengthy, too depressing, and too serious. Audiences, however, stood and cheered. Everywhere, the immigrant story resonated. Benny had another concept by 2001. He established Benny Andersson's orchestra, BOW. There were 16 musicians on it. They were all among the best in Sweden, some folk, some classical. Tommy Körberg and Helen Sjöholm joined as vocalists. The Swedish charts were topped by their debut album and spent 55 weeks there. Time and time again, BO traveled around the nation. It was more than just concerts, though. It was tradition, community, and dancing. It was like being in Sweden again. Music was not being reinvented by Benny. He was returning home with it. Benny's own ears also changed over time. The man who made pop the best in the world quit listening to it altogether. He only listens to Bach these days, each evening. He claimed that it has a magical quality that transcends melody. He put out a solo piano CD on Deutsche Grammophon in 2017. After leaving ABBA, Benny Andersson's life continued to go forward. In unexpected ways, it really became richer, deeper, and more significant. Something remarkable occurred in 1995. He was given a music professorship by the Swedish government. This was no typical title. In Swedish culture, it is among the highest accolades, often saved for those who have altered the perception of their art. Among them was Benny, but that was just the start. He became a member of the Royal Swedish Academy of Music 12 years later in 2007. The best musicians in Sweden are part of the group, which has been around since 1771. Participating in it entails being acknowledged as a national treasure. Additionally, he received an honorary doctorate from Stockholm University in 2008 for more than simply his musical successes. They recognized his contributions to the preservation of Swedish folk music as well as his mentoring of aspiring musicians. Coming from a man who began his career as a teenage organist in Stockholm, playing just in local churches, that meant a lot. From minor performances, he rose to international fame and is today regarded in the finest musical circles. Benny, however, shared that knowledge. He witnessed what celebrity might do to people by the late 1990s. He had experienced it. Expectations, pressure, and the temptation to use alcohol to cope with stress. Young musicians shouldn't have to endure the same thing alone, in his opinion. He so began coaching up-and-coming talent. Had established Mono Music back in 1987. It was more than simply a label, though. It developed become a secure environment for up-and-coming songwriters and composers. His studio on Skepsholmen Island, in the center of Stockholm, was open to many of them. He taught them more than just music there. He discussed how to stay grounded, survive, and create music that is inspired by one's soul rather than merely the charts. He helped launch some of the most well-known contemporary names in the area. However, Benny's discussion of his freedom may be the most telling aspect of his later years. He made a statement in a 2017 interview that few would anticipate from a man who penned some of the most well-known pop tunes in history. As a musician, I'm more liberated now than I was during my time with ABBA. Music is pure and personal, he remarked, adding that there would be no more deadlines or pressure to impress anyone. He didn't seek attention. He chose to follow his curiosity instead. He wrote musicals based on Swedish history, such as Christina from Du Vemola. Piano is an album he recorded as a solo pianist. In 2017, it was just him and a piano with no lyrics or elaborate productions. And for some reason, that modest little record reached the top of the German and UK classical charts. It served as a reminder that music may be heard without shouting.